The most dangerous words in a marriage are never shouted. They're the ones spoken with a smile. Christmas Eve settled over Savannah like a painting brushed in gold and evergreen. Every oak tree draped with glowing lights. Every historic square wrapped in ribbons that danced beneath the cool December breeze. Inside the Cross Estate, overlooking the Wilmington River, everything looked flawless. The towering Christmas tree reached nearly 20 feet toward the vaulted ceiling, covered with hand-blown glass ornaments collected from years of travels across Europe, while a fire crackled inside a limestone fireplace that had warmed generations before either of them had ever existed. Crystal glasses reflected the soft candlelight. Cinnamon and roasted turkey filled the air. Classical Christmas music drifted gently through hidden speakers. It looked like the kind of evening families remembered forever. Nathaniel Cross barely noticed any of it. Sitting at the far end of the mahogany dining table in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he scanned the final page of a contract illuminated by the glow of his tablet. Numbers, signatures, deadlines. Another acquisition completed before dessert. Another victory added to an empire built on discipline, influence, and impossible expectations. His assistant quietly placed a fountain pen beside him before disappearing without a sound. Nathaniel signed his name with the same calm precision he used for every important decision in his life. Across the room, Claire Whitmore Cross stood beside the Christmas tree, gently adjusting a tiny porcelain angel that had always leaned slightly to the left. She smiled faintly to herself, remembering the year they had found it in a small antique shop during an unexpected snowstorm in Vermont. Nathaniel had laughed that day, insisting the angel looked as stubborn as she was. She had laughed harder because it was the rare kind of joke only she could pull from him. That memory felt impossibly distant now. She glanced toward the dining table. He still hadn't looked up. The wrapped gift she had placed beside his plate remained untouched, tied carefully with a dark green ribbon she had chosen because he once told her green reminded him of peace, even if he had never admitted he needed any. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times. Dinner was ready. Staff quietly withdrew, leaving husband and wife alone as they always preferred on Christmas Eve. Claire finally sat across from him. She waited. Nathaniel finished reviewing one last document before placing the tablet beside his plate. "Everything looks beautiful," he said automatically, though his eyes never lingered on the decorations long enough to appreciate them. Claire nodded. "I hope we'd have dinner before the food gets cold." He offered a polite smile. Business couldn't wait. She looked toward the snow beginning to fall outside the windows. Christmas usually does. Silence settled between them. Not hostile, just painfully familiar. The kind that arrives after too many conversations postponed until tomorrow. Nathaniel reached for his wine glass. "You know how December is." Claire studied him carefully. His face was as composed as ever. Calm, confident, untouchable. Years earlier she had admired that strength. Lately it had begun to feel like a locked door with no key. She pushed the small gift across the table. "Merry Christmas." He looked at it briefly before setting his glass down. "I'll open it after dinner." She folded her hands together. "That's what you said last year." Nathaniel sighed almost imperceptibly, leaning back in his chair. "Claire, and the year before." He rubbed one temple, exhausted more by the conversation than by work itself. "We've been through this." Her voice remained soft. "No, we've walked around it." Another long silence followed. The fire continued to crackle. Somewhere outside, church bells echoed across the river. Nathaniel finally let out a quiet breath and offered a crooked smile that carried more confidence than comfort. Nothing lasts forever. He meant the argument, the disappointment, the difficult moment that would eventually fade away like every disagreement before it. But the words landed differently. Claire lowered her eyes. Something inside her became impossibly still. She gave a tiny nod, almost too small to notice. "You're right," she whispered. She rose from the table with perfect composure, smoothing the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater before disappearing upstairs without another word. Nathaniel remained seated, convinced she simply needed a few minutes alone. He picked up his fork, glanced once toward the untouched present, and reached for another document lying beside his plate. Upstairs, Claire opened the bedroom closet. She pulled out a single leather suitcase that had not been used in years. Carefully, quietly, she folded only the things that still felt like hers. Downstairs, Christmas music continued playing as if nothing had changed. Nathaniel never heard the closet door close. He never heard the zipper. And when the front door finally opened beneath the glow of 1,000 Christmas lights, the only sound left inside the mansion was the ticking of the grandfather clock. counting the first seconds of a life neither of them had expected to begin that night. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of silver, and the Cross estate looked exactly as it had the night before. The Christmas lights still shimmered across the balcony. The wreath still hung perfectly centered on the front door. Fresh coffee still waited on the dining table at precisely 7 o'clock because the household staff followed routines that never changed. Nathaniel walked downstairs in a crisp white shirt, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve while glancing through overnight emails on his phone. He noticed Claire's chair was empty, but that hardly surprised him. She often escaped to the sunroom early on holiday mornings with a novel and a blanket. He poured himself coffee without thinking twice. "Has Mrs. Cross already had breakfast?" he asked calmly. The house manager hesitated for the briefest moment. "No, sir." Nathaniel looked up. "She's still upstairs?" "I don't believe so, sir." He frowned, more puzzled than concerned, and climbed the staircase at an unhurried pace. Their bedroom was immaculate. The curtains had already been drawn open by the automatic system, allowing pale winter sunlight to spill across polished hardwood floors. Her side of the bed was neatly made. Her favorite cream-colored throw blanket was gone. So was the leather suitcase that had rested in the corner of the closet for years. Nathaniel opened the closet doors wider. Several empty hangers swung gently, almost unnoticed. A few shelves that had once held folded sweaters now sat bare. The jewelry box remained on the dresser, but only a simple wedding band lay inside beside a handwritten note no larger than a postcard. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably Claire's. "I finally believed you." There was no accusation, no anger, no dramatic farewell, just 5 quiet words. Nathaniel stared at the paper longer than he cared to admit. Then he folded it once and slipped it into his jacket pocket as though it were nothing more than another receipt needing to be filed away. She needed space, he told himself. She would visit her sister, maybe spend a few days at the coast. Eventually she would answer his calls, and they would have the conversation they had postponed for months. Life would return to normal because it always had. He instructed his driver to prepare the car for an afternoon meeting downtown and left the estate exactly on schedule. Savannah continued celebrating Christmas. Families wandered beneath garlands decorating River Street. Children laughed while chasing each other around Ellis Square. Horse-drawn carriages rolled slowly across cobblestone streets lined with boutiques glowing in holiday colors. Nathaniel barely noticed any of it. His day unfolded with mechanical precision. Contracts were reviewed. Phone calls completed. Investors reassured. Every decision remained sharp. Every number remained exact. Yet small interruptions began appearing where none had existed before. During lunch, he instinctively reached for the second cup of coffee that was no longer waiting beside his plate. At his office, someone asked whether Mrs. Cross would attend the annual New Year's charity gala, and he answered, "I'll check with her," before realizing he had no idea where she was. Late that afternoon, he returned home as the sun disappeared behind Spanish moss and church steeples. The mansion greeted him with perfect silence. Usually Claire played soft jazz while preparing dinner, humming absent-mindedly as she moved between the kitchen island and the stove. Tonight the speakers remained off. The kitchen counters looked untouched. A single ceramic mug rested beside the sink, exactly where she had washed it the previous evening. Nathaniel loosened his tie and wandered through rooms he rarely entered without purpose. The library smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. One of Claire's bookmarks still rested inside an unfinished novel. The sunroom contained the half-finished jigsaw puzzle she had been working on throughout December. Nearly every edge piece had been completed, but the snowy village at the center remained unfinished, tiny gaps scattered across the picture like forgotten conversations. He stood there longer than expected before quietly sitting in the chair she always chose because it caught the last light of day. Outside, the fountain continued flowing. Wind stirred the magnolia branches. Somewhere in the distance, Christmas carolers sang beneath the glow of street lamps. Nathaniel pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled to Claire's name. His thumb hovered over the call button. For reasons he couldn't explain, he put the phone away without dialing. She would come home when she was ready, he assured himself again. But as darkness settled over the estate, the grandfather clock echoed through hallways that suddenly felt much larger than before, and for the first time in years, the silence inside the house demanded more attention than every voice outside it. 3 days passed, and Nathaniel Cross continued living according to a schedule that had once made him one of the most respected businessmen in Savannah. Every meeting began on time. Every decision remained calculated. Every employee still stood when he entered a room. From the outside, Nothing had changed. Yet inside the estate overlooking the river, invisible cracks widened with every quiet hour. On the fourth morning after Christmas, Nathaniel walked into the kitchen expecting breakfast to be waiting exactly as it always had. The chef greeted him with a polite smile before placing eggs, toast, and coffee on the marble island. Nathaniel took one sip and immediately paused. The coffee tastes different. The chef lowered his eyes. Mrs. Cross used to grind a separate blend herself every morning, sir. Nathaniel stared into the dark liquid. He had never known there was a different blend. He simply assumed coffee appeared because coffee always appeared. Without another word, he pushed the cup aside and left for work. That afternoon, an architect arrived at his downtown office carrying blueprints for the restoration of an old waterfront property Nathaniel had purchased months earlier. As they discussed budgets and timelines, the architect unfolded a page covered with handwritten notes. Elegant handwriting, small sketches in the margins, suggestions for preserving original brickwork while creating brighter family spaces. Nathaniel recognized the handwriting instantly. "Who wrote these?" he asked. "Mrs. Cross," the architect answered with a smile. "She visited twice while you were traveling in New York. She said you loved history more than you admitted, so she hoped the house would feel timeless instead of expensive." Nathaniel looked silently across the drawings. Every revision improved the design. Every detail reflected thoughtfulness he had never bothered to notice. "She had remarkable instincts," the architect continued. "Honestly, half these ideas came from her." Nathaniel closed the folder. "Leave it with me." The architect thanked him and walked away, never realizing the weight those few sentences had left behind. Driving home through Savannah's historic district, Nathaniel found himself slowing near Forsyth Park. Families wandered beneath towering live oaks draped with Spanish moss, while children chased pigeons across the fountain plaza. Couples carried cups of hot chocolate, bundled together against the December air. He remembered another winter years ago when Claire had insisted they spend an afternoon there instead of attending an exclusive holiday reception. She had bought roasted pecans from a street vendor and laughed when powdered sugar landed on the front of his expensive coat. At the time, he considered it an inconvenience. Now the memory returned with painful clarity because he could no longer remember the last business dinner that had once seemed so important. Back at the estate, twilight settled gently over the river. Nathaniel wandered upstairs without removing his coat. He opened a hallway closet searching for an old set of property records, and instead found several neatly labeled storage boxes. Every Christmas decoration was organized by year. Each box contained handwritten notes. The lights Nathaniel liked best. The ornament we bought after Charleston. Grandmother Eleanor's angel. Handle carefully. Curious despite himself, he carried one box into the living room. Beneath layers of tissue paper rested dozens of ornaments collected throughout their marriage. A tiny wooden sailboat from Maine. A silver bell from Aspen. A glass cardinal from North Carolina. Each one carried a small tag describing when they found it together. Nathaniel sat on the floor beside the towering tree as evening settled outside. One by one, he lifted each ornament, reading memories Claire had quietly preserved because she believed they mattered. He struggled to remember half of them. She had remembered every single one. Hours slipped by unnoticed until the house manager entered quietly. "Sir." Nathaniel looked up. "Your dinner is ready." He glanced toward the untouched ornaments scattered around him like pieces of a life someone else had carefully assembled. "I'm not hungry." The house manager nodded respectfully before leaving. Alone again, Nathaniel reached for the final ornament resting at the bottom of the box. It was a simple porcelain house with warm yellow windows painted across its tiny walls. A folded note rested beneath it. Claire's familiar handwriting filled the small card. "A home isn't built by the person who owns it. It's built by the person who keeps choosing to stay." Nathaniel read the sentence twice. Then a third time. The fire crackled softly across the room while shadows danced against the ceiling. For the first time since she had walked away, he stopped asking himself when Claire would return. Instead, another question quietly settled into the silence, one he had never allowed himself to consider before. Had she already been leaving him long before she packed that suitcase? The following Monday, Nathaniel Cross canceled his first meeting in nearly 8 years. His executive assistant blinked twice before quietly confirming the change, convinced she had misheard him. He offered no explanation. Instead, he stood alone beside the office window overlooking Savannah's historic district, watching people hurry through another cold winter morning with cups of coffee in their hands and scarves wrapped around their necks. The city moved exactly as it always had. Only his own life seemed strangely suspended between two moments, one that had already ended and another that refused to begin. By noon, he found himself sitting inside the black SUV, giving his driver an address he had memorized years ago but had never visited. Claire's older sister, Evelyn Brooks, lived in a restored Victorian home nearly 20 miles away on the quieter side of town. Nathaniel had attended birthdays there, Thanksgiving dinners, even one 4th of July barbecue. He remembered laughter echoing across the backyard. He remembered Claire convincing neighborhood children to help decorate homemade cupcakes. He remembered leaving early every single time because business called. Evelyn answered the door wearing a thick gray cardigan and flowers still dusting one sleeve. Surprise crossed her face for only a second before settling into polite restraint. "Nathaniel, is Claire here?" She studied him carefully, almost as though deciding whether he deserved an answer. "No. Has she been here?" Evelyn folded her arms gently. "She visited. She isn't staying anymore." Nathaniel released a quiet breath. "Where did she go?" "She asked me not to tell you." The answer landed with more weight than he expected. "I only want to speak with her." Evelyn looked toward the family photographs lining the hallway behind her. Nearly every picture included Claire smiling beside someone else. Parents, friends, nieces, neighbors. Nathaniel appeared in only a handful of them. "Do you know what she said before she left?" Evelyn asked softly. He remained silent. "She said she wasn't running away from you." Her voice stayed calm. She was finally walking toward herself. Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "If she contacts you," Evelyn interrupted him with surprising kindness. "She doesn't hate you." He looked back up. "Then why won't she see me?" Evelyn smiled sadly. "Because every time she tried to talk before, you convinced her there would always be another conversation tomorrow." The front porch suddenly felt colder. Nathaniel nodded once. "Thank you." He turned toward the waiting vehicle without another word. On the drive back through Savannah, he asked the driver to take the long route along River Street. Storefronts remained dressed for the holidays. Couples carried shopping bags while musicians played cheerful songs outside old brick buildings. Life seemed remarkably ordinary. Nathaniel noticed small things he had overlooked for years. A florist arranging winter roses in a display window. An elderly couple sharing a bench beneath bare oak branches. Parents lifting a child high enough to place a paper star onto a community Christmas tree. Claire had always paused for moments like these. He had always been in a hurry to reach the next destination. As dusk settled over the city, Nathaniel instructed the driver to stop outside a neighborhood bookstore. The owner recognized him immediately, but seemed surprised to see him browsing alone. He wandered quietly through narrow aisles until he reached the local history section. A familiar leather notebook rested on a display table with Claire's elegant handwriting visible across several sticky notes tucked between the pages. The owner smiled warmly. "Your wife practically organized this entire shelf for me earlier this fall. She said Savannah deserved better recommendations than the bestseller list." Nathaniel gently opened the notebook. Inside, Claire had written titles she hoped to read together someday, adding tiny comments beside each one. One line caught his attention. "Stories only become homes when someone is willing to stay until the final page." He closed the notebook slowly. "May I buy this?" The owner shook his head. "I'm sorry. She asked me to keep it here. She said someone might need those words one day." Nathaniel thanked him and stepped back into the fading light. The streets glowed beneath strings of white Christmas lights stretching between historic buildings. Somewhere nearby, a choir rehearsed inside an old church, their voices drifting gently through the evening air. Nathaniel stood motionless on the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers finding comfort in the season. For the first time, he realized his search for Claire was no longer about bringing her back to the mansion. It was about discovering the man she had quietly stopped waiting for long before she ever walked out the front door. And somewhere beyond the lights of Savannah, Claire was living another day without expecting him to come looking at all. The answer Nathaniel had been chasing did not arrive through a phone call or a hidden address. It arrived through a forgotten filing cabinet. Nearly 2 weeks after Claire left, he returned to the private office inside the Cross estate intending to review tax documents before the new year. Instead, he discovered a drawer he had never opened because Claire had always handled everything labeled household. The folders were arranged with her familiar precision, each one dated, categorized, and tied with thin cotton ribbons rather than paper clips, because she once claimed beautiful things deserved beautiful care. Curious, Nathaniel pulled the first folder free. It contained letters from local charities thanking Claire for anonymous donations that had quietly restored playgrounds, funded scholarships, and repaired historic homes damaged during hurricanes. Every contribution had been made in the Cross family name. None had ever appeared in the newspapers. None had been mentioned at business dinners. The next folder held handwritten birthday lists for every employee at the estate: gardeners, housekeepers, drivers, kitchen staff. Next to each name, Claire had written favorite desserts, children's names, food allergies, anniversaries, and small personal details. One note simply read, "Mrs. Alvarez misses her son stationed overseas. Send flowers every Mother's Day." Nathaniel sat back in his chair, unable to remember Mrs. Alvarez's first name despite seeing her almost every week. Claire had remembered everything. He opened another folder. It contained correspondence with the family foundation. The executive director had written dozens of messages addressed to Claire, asking for advice before every fundraising gala. Her replies filled the margins in graceful handwriting, suggesting local artists to feature, veterans to recognize, teachers to honor, and small businesses to support instead of large corporations. Nathaniel realized with growing disbelief that several of the foundation's most celebrated projects had been Claire's ideas from the very beginning. His name had stood at every podium accepting praise. Her name had remained quietly hidden inside filing cabinets. The afternoon sunlight drifted slowly across the office floor while he continued reading. Receipts revealed she had personally paid tuition for an employee's daughter after learning the young woman had nearly dropped out of nursing school. Another envelope contained photographs from community events Nathaniel had missed because of conferences and negotiations. In every picture, Claire smiled beside families, volunteers, firefighters, librarians, and children decorating Christmas trees downtown. She looked completely at home in places where no cameras waited. Near the bottom of the cabinet rested a weathered journal. Nathaniel recognized the leather cover immediately. He had given it to Claire during their first wedding anniversary, joking that she always had too many thoughts for ordinary notebooks. She had laughed and kissed his cheek before promising she would fill every page someday. He hesitated before opening it. The entries were never bitter. That surprised him most. She rarely complained. Instead, she wrote about ordinary moments she hoped they might someday share again. A walk through Forsyth Park without checking emails. Breakfast on the back porch before sunrise. Watching the Christmas parade together instead of from separate schedules. One page stopped him completely. Nathaniel isn't cruel. He's simply carrying the weight of a world that never taught him how to set it down. I keep hoping one day he'll realize he doesn't have to earn love the way he earns respect. He closed the journal for several long moments before opening it again. Weeks later, another entry appeared. Today, he remembered the closing numbers from a meeting 6 months ago, but forgot we had planned dinner with my father. I watched him apologize while answering another phone call. I don't think he knows he's disappearing one conversation at a time. Nathaniel lowered the journal onto the desk. The room suddenly felt smaller than ever before. Every discovery uncovered another quiet sacrifice Claire had made without asking for recognition. She had protected his reputation, strengthened his businesses, supported his employees, comforted his family, and preserved memories he had barely noticed creating. She had never demanded applause. She had simply hoped he would notice she was standing beside him. As evening settled outside the office windows, Nathaniel walked slowly through the silent mansion. Every room carried traces of her invisible care. Fresh flowers had always appeared before guests arrived. Holiday traditions had never organized themselves. Favorite meals had never prepared themselves. Relationships had never remained strong by accident. Claire had been holding together hundreds of invisible threads while he admired only the finished tapestry. He stopped beside the towering Christmas tree that still glowed softly in the living room despite the season nearly ending. For the first time since she had left, he no longer wondered whether she had given up too soon. Instead, he found himself asking a far more painful question. How many years had she been fighting for a marriage that only one of them had been tending? January arrived with cold rains sweeping across Savannah, washing away the last traces of Christmas from the city streets. Storefront windows replaced wreaths with winter displays. The towering tree in Ellis Square disappeared piece by piece until only an empty space remained where families had gathered a few weeks before. Nathaniel Cross noticed the change because Claire always had. She used to say every season deserved a proper goodbye. This year, no one reminded him to look. The estate had become unbearably efficient. Every meal appeared exactly on time. Every room remained spotless. Every schedule unfolded without interruption. Yet nothing felt alive. One gray afternoon, Nathaniel attended a quarterly board meeting that should have demanded his full attention. Financial reports filled the conference room screens. Executives debated expansion plans along the East Coast. Normally, he would have anticipated every question before it was asked. Instead, his thoughts drifted toward a sentence written in Claire's journal. He doesn't have to earn love the way he earns respect. The words followed him through every presentation until his chief financial officer quietly asked, "Nathaniel, are you with us?" He looked up, realizing an uncomfortable silence had settled over the room. For the first time in anyone's memory, he had missed an important question entirely. He ended the meeting 20 minutes early. That evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows of the estate, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Margaret Ellis, director of the Savannah Heritage Community Center. Claire had volunteered there for years. Nathaniel answered immediately. "Mrs. Ellis." Relief softened the older woman's voice. "Mr. Cross, I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me." She hesitated. I wasn't sure whether Claire had mentioned the winter literacy program. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. No. She organized everything before Christmas, but she was planning to personally deliver the final shipment of children's books this week. We haven't been able to reach her, and the center opens tomorrow morning. Nathaniel looked toward the shelves lining his study. Where are the books? She rented a small storage unit near the waterfront. Only she knew the inventory system. I'll take care of it. An hour later, he stood inside a modest storage facility several miles from downtown. Rain echoed softly against the metal roof while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The manager unlocked the unit and stepped aside. Nathaniel expected stacks of cardboard boxes. Instead, he found something that looked like a carefully built little bookstore. Every carton carried handwritten labels sorted by age group, reading levels, school districts, even personal notes recommending titles for children struggling with confidence, grief, or loneliness. Claire had arranged hundreds of books with the same care she once used decorating their Christmas tree. Taped to one shelf was a checklist. The final line read, "Every child deserves one story that makes them believe tomorrow can be kinder than today." Nathaniel slowly lowered the clipboard. The manager smiled. "Your wife spent 3 weekends organizing this place herself." She said details matter because children notice when adults care. Nathaniel said nothing. He simply began carrying boxes to his SUV one by one despite the steady rain soaking through his overcoat. The next morning he arrived at the community center before sunrise. Volunteers were already gathering inside the old brick building, preparing reading corners and arranging colorful rugs for dozens of neighborhood children. Margaret Ellis greeted him with genuine surprise. "You came yourself." Nathaniel nodded. Claire would have. Together they unpacked every box. Volunteers smiled as familiar labels made organizing effortless. One teacher laughed after discovering Claire had included handwritten bookmarks decorated with watercolor birds. Another quietly wiped away tears while reading personalized notes tucked inside several donated novels. Everywhere Nathaniel looked, Claire's kindness had reached people he had never met. Before leaving, Margaret handed him a sealed envelope she had found inside the final carton. "She wrote this months ago," Margaret explained. "She asked me to give it to you only if you ever came here without her." Nathaniel waited until he returned to the empty estate before opening it. Inside was a single folded page. Her handwriting remained calm and steady. "If you're reading this, then something finally slowed you down enough to notice the little things. I hope they remind you that love was never hiding. It was simply waiting beside you every ordinary day." Nathaniel remained seated in the quiet study long after darkness covered the river outside. For months he had believed he needed to find Claire in order to repair what had been broken. Now he understood something far more difficult. Before he deserved another conversation with her, he first had to become the man she had patiently believed still existed beneath the life he had built around himself. By the middle of February, the people around Nathaniel Cross began noticing changes long before he did. He no longer left meetings the moment they ended. He asked employees about their families and remembered the answers the following week. He visited the Savannah Heritage Community Center every Saturday morning without announcing his arrival, helping unpack donated books, carrying folding tables, and quietly listening as children excitedly described their favorite stories. No cameras followed him. No reporters were invited. The recognition he had spent years accumulating suddenly felt meaningless beside conversations no newspaper would ever print. Margaret Ellis watched the transformation with cautious optimism, but never asked what had caused it. She simply handed him another stack of books each weekend, smiling whenever he stayed longer than expected. One rainy afternoon, as volunteers packed away chairs after a reading program, Margaret approached him carrying a sealed envelope. "Someone stopped by this morning," she said gently. Nathaniel looked up. "Claire." Margaret nodded once. She didn't come inside. She only wanted to know whether the children enjoyed the books. His heartbeat quickened despite the calm expression he tried to maintain. "Did she leave an address?" "No." Margaret hesitated before continuing. "But she asked me a question." Nathaniel waited silently. "She asked whether you looked happy." The question settled heavily between them. After a long pause, Margaret smiled with quiet kindness. "I told her you looked different." Nathaniel lowered his eyes. "Different isn't enough." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "But it's where every real change begins." That evening, Nathaniel drove without destination through the quiet streets of Savannah until he reached Forsyth Park. The fountain shimmered beneath warm lamplight, while early spring buds began appearing on branches that had looked lifeless only weeks before. He sat alone on the same weathered bench where Claire had once insisted they spend an afternoon feeding birds instead of attending another business luncheon. At the time, he had spent nearly the entire visit answering emails. Now he sat with nothing in his hands except silence. An elderly man settled onto the opposite end of the bench, balancing 2 paper cups of coffee. "Looks like you could use one," the stranger said with an easy smile, offering the second cup. Nathaniel accepted it with quiet thanks. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They simply watched families wander along shaded pathways, while children laughed near the fountain. Finally, the older man glanced toward the wedding band still resting on Nathaniel's hand. "My wife left me once," he said matter-of-factly. Nathaniel turned toward him. "Did she come back?" The man chuckled softly. "Eventually." Hope flickered across Nathaniel's face before the man continued. "But not because I convinced her." Nathaniel listened carefully. "She came back because I stopped trying to win the argument and started becoming someone worth coming home to." Those words lingered long after the stranger stood, wished him well, and disappeared beneath the moss-covered oaks. Nathaniel remained on the bench until sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and blue. For the first time, he understood that apologies were not measured by perfect speeches. They were measured by the life that followed them. The next morning, he walked into his executive board meeting carrying a single folder instead of the usual stack of reports. After greeting everyone, he calmly announced that he would be stepping back from several business ventures to restructure both his schedule and the family foundation. Shock spread across the room. Some executives immediately protested, warning him about lost opportunities and declining influence. Nathaniel listened respectfully before answering with a composure unlike anything they had expected. "I've spent years building successful companies," he said. "Now I'm going to build a better life." No one argued after that. Days later, while organizing old correspondence inside the estate, Nathaniel received an unexpected phone call from Evelyn Brooks. Her voice carried the same calm warmth it always had. "Claire agreed to see you." Nathaniel closed his eyes, unable to speak for several seconds. Evelyn continued gently. "She isn't asking for promises. She isn't asking for explanations." "Then why?" he finally whispered. "Because she wants to know whether the man asking for another conversation is the same one who never had time for the first." Nathaniel looked around the silent study that no longer felt like a prison, but a place where difficult truths had finally found him. He slipped Claire's first note into his jacket pocket beside the newer letter she had written for him. Then he quietly answered, "Tell her I'll come with nothing except the truth." For the first time in his life, the man who had negotiated impossible deals without hesitation realized that the most important meeting he would ever attend could not be won by power, influence, or perfect words. It could only be entered with humility, and that frightened him far more than failure ever had. Spring arrived quietly in Savannah, softening the sharp edges winter had left behind. Azaleas bloomed along quiet streets, fountains shimmered beneath warm afternoon sunlight, and the air carried the scent of fresh rain instead of pine. Nathaniel Cross drove without a driver for the first time in years, following directions Evelyn had texted only an hour earlier. The destination surprised him. It was not an expensive restaurant, a private estate, or an elegant hotel. It was a small community garden tucked behind an old brick church on the edge of the historic district, where volunteers spent weekends growing vegetables and flowers for local families. Children laughed as they carried tiny watering cans between raised garden beds. Elderly neighbors exchanged recipes while trimming herbs. The place felt wonderfully ordinary. Nathaniel spotted Claire almost immediately. She stood beneath a flowering dogwood tree wearing faded blue jeans, a light cream sweater, and gardening gloves dusted with soil. Her hair was tied loosely behind her neck, catching the breeze exactly as he remembered. She looked peaceful, not because life had become perfect, but because she no longer seemed exhausted from carrying someone else's world. For a long moment he remained beside the entrance, watching her smile as a little girl proudly held up a basket of strawberries. Claire knelt to celebrate the small harvest as though it were the greatest achievement of the season. Nathaniel realized he had rarely seen her smile like that during their final years together. Not because she had changed, but because he had stopped creating room for joy beside him. Claire finally looked up. Their eyes met across the garden. Neither of them moved. The sounds of conversation faded into the background until there was only the quiet space between two people who had once promised forever, without understanding how fragile forever could become. Nathaniel walked toward her slowly, stopping several feet away. He noticed she no longer wore her wedding ring. She noticed he still wore his. Neither of them mentioned it. Claire slipped off one gardening glove and folded it carefully into her hands. "You found the place." Nathaniel nodded. "I almost turned around twice." A faint smile crossed her face. "That's honest. I'm trying to make honesty a habit." She studied him for a moment. His suit jacket was gone, replaced by a simple navy sweater. The constant tension that had once lived across his shoulders seemed lighter somehow, not because life demanded less from him, but because he had finally stopped carrying it alone. "Evelyn said you wanted to talk," Claire said gently. Nathaniel took a slow breath. "I did." He looked around the garden before meeting her eyes again. "But I don't think I came here to convince you of anything anymore." Claire waited quietly. "I spent weeks trying to figure out what to say," he admitted. Every version sounded like a negotiation. Every apology sounded like I was asking for something in return. He smiled sadly. "You deserved better than another business proposal." Claire lowered her gaze. "Nathaniel," he continued before losing his courage. "I read your journal." She looked surprised, but not angry. "I found the letters. The community center. The scholarship records. The birthday lists. The ornaments. I found the life you built while I was busy building everything else." His voice remained steady, though softer than she had ever heard it. "I kept believing I was providing a future for us." He paused. "I didn't realize I was missing our present." Claire's eyes filled with quiet emotion, but she remained silent. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and unfolded the first note she had left behind. "I finally believed you." He looked down at the familiar handwriting before folding it once more. "Those 5 words have followed me every day." He lifted his eyes to hers. "You believed me because I gave you every reason to." The breeze stirred the dogwood blossoms above them, scattering white petals across the path. Children laughed somewhere behind the garden fence. Life continued gently around them, unconcerned with the conversation unfolding beneath the spring sky. Nathaniel took one careful step forward, leaving enough space for Claire to choose her own. "I'm not asking you to come home today," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me because I've changed for a few months." His voice grew quieter. "I only needed you to know that changing wasn't something I did to get you back. It became something I had to do because I finally understood the man I had become wasn't someone I wanted to remain." Claire searched his face for the certainty she used to find hidden beneath confidence. What she found instead was humility, fragile but genuine. After a long silence, she smiled through glistening eyes and gestured toward an empty garden bed waiting to be planted. "Then maybe," she said softly, "before we talk about where either of us belongs, you could help me plant something that will take time to grow." Nathaniel looked at the untouched patch of earth, then back at Claire. For the first time in years, he understood that the future could not be signed, purchased, or promised in a single afternoon. It had to be tended patiently, one ordinary day at a time. By the time Christmas returned to Savannah, the city seemed to breathe a little slower, as though it had quietly remembered everything the previous winter had tried to teach. White lights once again wrapped around ancient oak trees. Choirs filled the evening air with familiar melodies, and the windows of small bookstores and bakeries glowed with the same gentle warmth Claire had always loved. Nearly a year had passed since the night she had carried a single leather suitcase down the staircase of the Cross estate. So much had changed that even the mansion itself no longer felt like the same place. The formal dining room had become smaller in a way no architect could explain, not because its walls had moved, but because laughter now reached every corner. The office that had once consumed Nathaniel's evenings rarely remained occupied after sunset. Community events filled weekends that had once belonged entirely to business. Employees no longer whispered when he walked by. They greeted him with easy smiles, and he knew their names, their children's graduations, and the little victories they celebrated outside of work. None of those changes happened overnight. They had grown slowly, just like the garden Claire invited him to help plant that spring. Through summer heat and autumn rain, they met every Saturday morning. Sometimes they spoke for hours while pulling weeds or watering tomatoes. Sometimes they worked side by side in comfortable silence. There were difficult conversations, honest tears, moments of regret that neither of them tried to erase. Claire never pretended the past had disappeared, and Nathaniel never asked her to forget it. Instead, they chose something far more demanding. They chose to build new memories strong enough to stand beside the old ones. On Christmas Eve, Nathaniel arrived at the community garden carrying 2 simple paper bags instead of expensive gifts wrapped in designer ribbon. Inside one bag were homemade cinnamon rolls prepared from Claire's favorite recipe with considerable help from the estate's patient chef. Inside the other rested dozens of children's books for the holiday reading program they now organized together every December. Claire smiled the moment she saw the flowers still dusting one sleeve of his sweater. "You baked." Nathaniel laughed quietly. "Let's just say I participated." She opened the bag, breathing in the familiar scent of cinnamon and vanilla before looking back at him with amused disbelief. "They're not burned." The chef seemed equally surprised. They carried everything inside the small brick community center where volunteers were already decorating tables with evergreen branches and handmade ornaments crafted by neighborhood children. Margaret Ellis welcomed them with the same warm embrace she offered every volunteer, never treating Nathaniel differently because of his reputation or success. That had become one of his favorite parts of the place. Here, no one cared about boardrooms or headlines. They cared about showing up. As evenings settled outside, families gathered for the annual holiday reading. Nathaniel sat in a tiny wooden chair surrounded by children listening as Claire read a classic Christmas story aloud. He watched the way every child leaned closer with each page, completely trusting the kindness in her voice. A year earlier, he might have checked his phone halfway through the first chapter. Tonight the phone remained switched off inside his coat pocket, forgotten without effort. When the final page was finished, applause filled the room. Children hurried toward the refreshment table while volunteers exchanged hugs and holiday wishes. Nathaniel quietly walked over to the Christmas tree standing in one corner of the center. It was modest compared to the towering tree that once filled the mansion, decorated with handmade paper stars, family photographs, and ornaments donated by local residents. Claire joined him, slipping her hands into the pockets of her coat against the cool evening air drifting through the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply admired the lights reflecting softly against the windows. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and carefully unfolded the first note she had left behind nearly a year ago. The edges had become worn from being carried every day. He smiled before placing it gently inside a small wooden ornament shaped like a house and hanging it on the tree. Claire watched curiously. "You're leaving it there?" He nodded. "It belongs with the story now." She looked at him for a long moment before quietly reaching for his hand. This time, neither of them held on because they feared losing the other. They held on because they had finally learned how precious ordinary moments could be. Snow began falling lightly outside, covering the garden paths where tiny green shoots had once struggled through the spring soil. Nathaniel looked toward the softly glowing windows of the community center, then back at Claire with the peaceful certainty he had spent years searching for in all the wrong places. "I used to think building an empire was the greatest thing I'd ever do," he said. Claire squeezed his hand gently. "And now?" He smiled, not with confidence, but with gratitude. "Now I know the strongest things in life aren't built with power. They're built by choosing each other again and again, especially on the ordinary days." The church bells across Savannah began ringing as families stepped into the snowy evening carrying books, laughter, and warm boxes of cinnamon rolls. Nathaniel and Claire remained beneath the glowing Christmas tree for one quiet moment longer, understanding at last that forever had never been a promise someone could make with words. Forever began each morning with the simple decision to stay, to listen, and to love before it was too late.